ECT Tech Nugget, Technology Perspective. My name's Doug Bowie, and I'll be working my way through these slides and demos with you today, talking about technology perspective, which is kind of a meta concept in technology. We're not really talking about how technology works with, within society or something like that. I'm talking specifically about when we work with technology, how do we shift gears and shift perspectives from a piece of equipment to the network view, or from one perspective to another when we go from SSH to RDP or something like that. So not really talking about technology and its effects on society. I'm talking about how when we use technology as a technology expert, we switch perspectives and switch gears and viewpoints from one piece of technology or one viewpoint to another. And you'll want this when you're doing network design, and I go from the network view to the routing view, or when I go from working with a piece of technology that has a specific fixed perspective to a different one. We're going to have some demos with this as we go along, and we'll need this as we use different technologies and we use different perspectives to do the work of IT to get that kind of work done. Shifting perspectives, there's several examples that go with this. Windows in a house, there's a pretty easy way to understand that concept, where when I run to the north wall of the house, I look out the window and I can see the ocean. If I run to the east, I'm going to see a flower garden. If I run to the south, I'm going to see a forest. If I run to the west, I'm going to see traffic. Those are fixed perspectives, which is often what we're working with when we work in IT. I'm going to go to work with a specific machine, and when I'm in that window or I'm in that piece of software, I'm working with that system or that machine. And so a fixed perspective is pretty typical in an IT context. Another one might be when we drive a remote control car. When you grab the controller and you sit down and you think about it, when you swing left on the RC controller, the car swings to the left. We're no longer really thinking like ourselves. Our mind's eye is with the RC car. We're kind of GoPro'd on top of the car, and as it swings to the left, we think about it from the perspective of the car, and that's why we go left. When the car disappears out of sight and is gone, oh my gosh, what happened? Well, the car's gone. I can't think like the car anymore because I can't see it. So we've had a broken perspective at that point. And that happens sometimes when we do this kind of stuff in IT. A couple others would be a video game avatar, right? The camera tends to follow our video game avatar through the game as we do that kind of stuff. And so it's always sort of hovering. Maybe it's third person or it's first person, but we're always in the perspective of the avatar when we're in a video game. VR headsets offer an interesting shift of perspective because being as immersive as they are, they'll give us a 360-degree view of this perspective. So unlike the window in the house where we look out the window and it's fixed, the VR headset is often fixed maybe from a mobility standpoint in that I can't move, but when done correctly, I can spin 360 degrees and up. I'm getting, a half dome perspective of where I'm standing. And if I live where I live in the Midwest and, I put on something that shows me in the Arctic, I'm going to have that immersive perspective of being in the Arctic. And there might be sounds and sights, things like that go with it that help my perspective, but ultimately my perspective is shifted when I do that. So let's talk a little more deeply about some of these kinds of things. The RC car perspective, I've got some pictures here showing an RC car, the different perspectives. So the bottom two are the user controlling the car, and the top one is the perspective of the car with a camera on top of it. So we can see the car and the street view and that kind of stuff. On the right side, we can see we're projecting it as from the GoPro, and as we drive, we can see that. In the lower left, we get to see a little of both, right? We see a guy with a VR headset on driving the car, but then in the lower left, we can see the perspective of the car, what the user sees at that point. These are shifting perspectives, and they become very important when we go off to do control of remote systems, because much of our work in IT has to do with virtual systems or remote systems where, especially after and during COVID, a lot of our work is remote, which means we're going to be touching remote systems from our perspective. I'm at home, but none of the stuff I work with is at home. It's far away, right? It's wherever the equipment is or the virtual machine is. So getting into a more an IT perspective of this is one of the earliest pictures that I could find written by a guy named Dern, that sort of is trying to understand this concept. And this picture has a little bit of a nuance with it. So we can see it's like astral projection. And astral projection is sort of a metaphysical concept, but this is a completely virtual idea. So metaphysics and virtual aren't that far apart. But what we're seeing in the lower picture is a person using a computer, and there's a little X on the window if you look closely at that monitor. And as he floats forward to his virtual whatever he's connected to, we see the same person at a keyboard, but the X now fills the entire screen. And what that's telling us is that the X on the physical keyboard and mouse might be a window to a complete system on the far end. So we're going to talk briefly, I'm going to use examples of two different, because there's generally two types of connections that we use when we do this kind of technology. I'm going to use these as example. They're pretty common in our academic work and in our lab use. So my students will see that a lot, and we're going to talk a little about them. One is RDP, or Remote Desktop Protocol. It's a remote control kind of technology. It lets us reach out and do full remote control of a remote GUI system. So it's not text-based, it's point and click, it's icons, it's whatever you would see. This system can be used to do remote support, where I'm at one location and I can remote control someone else's computer to give them a hand, but it brings all of the GUI elements back to me, either in a window or in full screen, and that lets me work with that and use that. There are other products that do this. TeamViewer is one, VNC is one, RDP is the one we use, so it's the one I'll use as an example. But there are multiple packages that do this kind of thing. We use them for our ghost connections, so you'll see Remote Desktop. If you're one of my students, you'll see Remote Desktop in that context. Remote sessions. Remote sessions are a little more unique. They're usually, our example here will be SSH, which is a text interface, so command line CLI, command line interface, made for a text connection. Now the nice part about SSH, it's really low bandwidth. So if I'm tethered over my phone or I'm having bandwidth issues, SSH will squeak through. It's a little teeny small bandwidth, right? With RDP or TeamViewer or VNC, we bring all those GUI elements. We're going to use a lot more bandwidth. We're going to use a lot more latency sensitive. As I move the mouse, it better do its thing. With remote sessions, you probably can't type faster than even a low bandwidth connection will allow for. So you'll be able to pound along and it'll generate and do things as we make those remote sessions. So one's text, one's GUI. That's going to be important to keep in mind as we go along. However, one's going to be remote control and the other one's going to be remote sessions. So also keep those distinctions in mind. And we're going to explore those a little more. And in fact, I went through media and I found two different movies that sort of highlight these two different types of connections. So there's a 2009 movie called Surrogates starring Bruce Willis, and he's got a relationship with the technology that is very similar to RDP. And then also Ready Player One, which was a book and is a 2018 movie starring Ty Sheridan. And his relationship with the technology is much more similar to SSH. And we're going to explore each one of those movies just with a slide or two, and then we're going to talk about what that means. So here's our picture of, Bruce Willis in the movie. And on the left side, we can see Bruce sort of in a techno chair with his eyes covered up. And what we wind up finding out is that Bruce Willis, in the right-hand picture, we see two different images of Bruce. And the far right image is Bruce in real life, much like he is laying in that bed with the goatee. And so the audience knows this is real life. And the left picture where he's got no goatee, this is him driving his Android avatar. So as he lays in the bed, he drives this avatar through life, and it can be beat up. It's very difficult to destroy and that kind of stuff. But what we're seeing is a remote control of an entire system. His entire consciousness is pushed to that Android body, and he can live his life with relative impunity, right? They cut off his arm, and it's just a robot arm. They put another one on. It's not that big a deal. He's not risking his actual self. And when, he wakes up from the bed, the robot just kind of stands there and doesn't do anything. It doesn't go away, but it's not doing anything because there's no consciousness in it driving it. This is very similar to RDP or TeamViewer or VNC kind of connections. And we'll talk about what that means. When we disconnect from our RDP session, the remote session continues to run. It doesn't just stop or disappear. It's still there. It's just not doing anything because nobody's driving it. The second movie is Ready Player One. And in this movie, we're going to see on the right side, we see the user in real life. And I'm sorry, I forget the character's name, as he's in his VR gear. And you can see the cables and the wires and the haptic suit and the visor and all that, which immerses him in the VR world, which is what we see on the left. This is his avatar in the world of Ready Player One, as he's in there interacting with the movie and interacting with characters. But if you'll recall from the movie, when the visor comes off, the avatar disappears. It's gone. It no longer exists in that simulation. He can't interact with it. No one can interact with it. And when he puts the visor back on, he reinserts himself back into that world, and he shows up and can interact with it again. But that concept of he disappears when he takes the headset off is very important. It's very much like an SSH session, where when you're not there, the session's gone, and it's just gone. The resources of the machine go on. If there's anything else going on in the machine, it's still there. The machine's there, but the session is gone. That's the primary difference between these two perspectives, and why it's important to move back and forth to understand those perspectives. So we would consider RDP to be persistent, meaning the applications that I leave running when I connect with an RDP connection, I leave Word running, it's going to be there when I get back. Word will still be running. The web browser that I left running in my RDP session is still there, because the remote machine never loses its concept of what's running, even though RDP goes away. SSH we consider to be ephemeral. Now I'm going to put the word typically after that, because there are some things we can do. In its typical use, SSH is ephemeral, which means if you close the SSH window on your end, the session and everything that was in it goes with it and is gone. When you reconnect, anything that you left is gone. The session is ephemeral. It's all the sessions or all the programs that were associated with your connection when you made it are gone. That's a very important distinction to make. Now, in SSH, we can do some things, the program's called Screen, where we can make it not ephemeral. But typical use, SSH is ephemeral. And that's important to understand. If you have an interruption in your internet connection while you're in an SSH session, poof, it's gone. So you'll want to think about that when you make those connections. If you need to learn what Screen is, so your SSH sessions aren't ephemeral, that might be a path worthy of going down, especially if you're tethered through your phone, which has kind of cruddy service. Okay, I can reconnect to my SSH session if I used Screen to capture it and keep it running while I'm not connected. So that's going to be an interesting perspective shift that we're going to need to understand. These are not the only perspective shifts in our IT technology world, but these are two good examples of being able to shift back and forth between perspectives. All right, and I'm going to do a practical demonstration of this so that we can kind of see the difference as we go along. All right, so you're looking at a section of my Windows desktop. I've started the remote desktop connection client, and we're going to connect into one of the machines in my lab environment. So you can see that it's, Windows here, and I haven't done anything exciting. I'm going to hit connect button, and it's going to connect me to my remote machine, and we'll start a browser, and we'll go somewhere in it. So we'll go to the university's page. There we go. So there's Ohio University's front page. We'll start a terminal window, and we'll run htop, which will sort of bounce along and change, and it'll show that the program's running all the time, right? Normally it shows CPU utilization, stuff like that, but we can see it's bouncing along and changing. I'm going to reach up and disconnect the connection to it, so the client's going to go away on my end. However, all the programs that are still running in that session, because it's a remote control of a remote system, a full remote control, whatever I started continues to run. And there it is, it's still running. If I move it around, I can disconnect and reconnect. And this allows for things like, I'm at the coffee shop, I'm working on a system, I start something big, and I want to go home. Oh, okay, I just kill the connection, and I get home, and I need to pick it up where I left off, and I reach over and reconnect, and there it is. It's still running, it's still grinding away. This is pretty typical for remote control, persistent remote control. That's pretty typical kind of stuff. There are a number of other ways to do it. Like I said, TeamViewer, VNC. RDP can be set up in such a way that you can share. So, if you need to do tech support with grandma's Windows laptop, grandma can let you in and she can see what you're doing and you can see what you're doing and you can sort of talk about it. TeamViewer and VNC do those same kind of shared. They're looking at the local resource, you're looking at the remote resource, but you're both looking at the same thing. That can be very useful from a support standpoint. We're not using it that way here, but it can be used that way and it's quite nice. Once again, this is my Windows machine. I've opened up a PowerShell window. I'm going to SSH into the same machine. Same machine I already P'd into is running an SSH server, so we can see what's going on with it. You can see here it's kind of giving me some of the first time login things. That's going to happen every time because this session is not persistent. So it's going to assume every time it sees you, hey, I'm new. So we'll start htop, right? We can see htop. There's lots of processes that are persistent, but the things that we start with our SSH session will not be persistent. So for example, this htop, when I kill this connection here, that stops running on the remote machine. So if I start it again and we go look at the terminal, right, we SSH back in, it's not running. So when I disconnect the session from SSH, when the session disappears, all the programs that were started in that session disappear. This is typically why when we SSH into a machine, we are also working with daemons, or daemons, depending on your terminology that you like. And that means they are persistent. Daemons are a persistent process that runs often on the other side. They're called services in Windows. They exist, and they are persistent. So oftentimes we're configuring and reconfiguring things that are persistent. So we might edit something and restart the daemon, and it is persistent. But the things that we start directly in the shell, not persistent with the session. So if you type nano will not be running when we come back. It will be all gone. Not persistent because it's running only within that session. This sounds like I'm belaboring the point, but the truth is, I had a bunch of people ask me questions about this where they couldn't quite wrap their head around the perspective shift between persistent connections and ephemeral sessions, and they can be a little tricksy. We do a lot of this perspective shifting in the IT world. This is very typical. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this Tech Nugget on technology perspectives, and we'll see you for the next Tech Nugget.